Hey everyone, welcome back to another incredible story that will leave you inspired and maybe a little fired up. We've all experienced bad service at some point, but what if the owner of a business went undercover to see just how bad things really were? Well, that's exactly what happens in today's story. A motel chain owner disguises himself as a regular guest, only to uncover shocking mismanagement, lazy employees, and a toxic work culture. But because he's not just here to observe, he's here to clean house. Stick around because this one is truly satisfying. Ethan Caldwell had spent the last 5 years expanding his small roadside motel business into a growing chain. What had once been a modest family-run operation had grown to nearly a dozen locations, scattered along highways and in mid-sized towns. With success, however, came distance. He no longer handled day-to-day operations, relying instead on regional managers to oversee the business. At first, things seemed to run smoothly, but recently, complaints had begun trickling in. Guests reported poor service, unclean rooms, and dismissive staff. Negative reviews started surfacing online, and customer satisfaction scores were dropping. Ethan's managers assured him that the complaints were minor issues, nothing to worry about, but something didn't sit right with him. He had built his business on the idea of providing clean, affordable lodging with friendly service. Yet, what he was hearing suggested the opposite. Determined to get answers, Ethan decided to investigate for himself. But he knew he wouldn't get the truth by simply walking in as the owner. Employees would straighten up, managers would scramble to impress him, and he would be fed a curated version of reality. If he wanted to see the real problems, he had to go undercover. Ditching his usual polished look, he threw on an old, worn-out jacket, faded jeans, and a baseball cap, letting his beard grow in a little to appear unkempt. His goal was simple: pose as a regular traveler, experience the motel's service firsthand, and see how guests were really treated. The motel he chose was one of the newest additions to his chain, recently acquired from a struggling independent owner. He hadn't personally visited this location before, and the staff had never met him in person. That made it the perfect place for his test. If his managers were right, he would confirm that things were running smoothly. But if the complaints were valid, he would find out just how deep the problems ran. As he pulled into the motel's dimly lit parking lot, Ethan took a deep breath, already spotting signs of neglect. The neon sign flickered, the pavement was cracked, and a few faded cars sat parked haphazardly near the entrance. He grabbed his duffel bag and made his way inside, ready to discover the truth, one way or another. Ethan pushed open the glass door of the motel lobby, the small bell above jingling dully. The air inside was stale, slightly musty, with the faintest hint of cleaning chemicals trying and failing to mask it. The dim lighting cast long shadows across the worn carpet, and the front desk looked like it hadn't been deep cleaned in months. He approached the counter where a young man in his early 20s, slouched in his chair, barely looked up from his phone. His name tag read Liam, though Ethan doubted he'd be getting any warm personal service. After a long pause, Liam finally acknowledged him with a half-hearted nod. "Need a room?" Ethan said, keeping his voice casual, sliding a credit card onto the counter. Liam barely glanced at it before sighing. "We don't rent to locals." Ethan frowned. "Excuse me?" The front desk clerk rolled his eyes, as if he'd had this conversation 100 times before. "Policy, man. No locals. Management says it's to avoid problems." Ethan felt a slow burn of irritation rising in his chest. He had expected some issues, maybe rudeness, maybe poor service, but being outright denied a room? That was a new one. He kept his face neutral, forcing himself to stay in character. "I don't get it. I have money. I can pay." Liam shrugged. "Doesn't matter. Management says locals cause trouble. You're from around here, so I can't book you." Ethan narrowed his eyes. His own motel had a policy barring locals? That was absurd. He had built his brand on affordability and accessibility, yet here was an employee turning away paying customers based on pure assumption. Before he could push further, another voice cut in. "What's going on?" A middle-aged man in a wrinkled button-up strode over, his name tag reading Mark, General Manager. His expression soured the moment he saw Ethan, eyes flicking over his faded clothes and scruffy appearance. "He's local," Liam explained lazily. "I want a room." Mark's lips curled into a smirk. then he should find another motel. Ethan clenched his jaw, exhaling slowly. He had seen enough for now. Without another word, he grabbed his credit card, turned, and walked out. But as he left, he caught sight of another employee watching the exchange. Tessa, the front desk associate, her expression conflicted. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Ethan returned to the motel early the next morning, this time with a different plan. If he wanted to truly understand the problems, he needed to get inside, not as a guest, but as an employee. He had already seen how guests were treated. Now, he needed to experience what it was like behind the counter. He stepped through the front door, dressed the same as before, playing the part of a man looking for work. At the front desk, the same young woman who had watched him get turned away the night before was on shift. Tessa. She looked up from her computer, surprise flashing in her eyes before she masked it with polite indifference. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Yeah," Ethan said, keeping his tone casual. "I heard you guys might be hiring. I've worked at the front desk before, just looking for something steady." Tessa hesitated, glancing toward the manager's office, where Mark was nowhere to be seen. She lowered her voice slightly. "We do need people. A couple of employees quit last week." Before she could say more, another figure approached, the assistant manager, Damien, a man in his late 20s who looked perpetually stressed. He took one glance at Ethan and sighed. "Are you looking for a job?" Ethan nodded. Damien rubbed his temple. "Have you had any experience?" "Yeah," Ethan said, lying smoothly. "Worked at the front desk at a motel a couple years back. Handled check-ins, customer service, all that." That was all Damien needed to hear. With a shrug, he pulled a clipboard from under the counter. "We're short-staffed, and I don't have time to go through a whole hiring process. If you can start today..." Ethan raised an eyebrow. Just like that? No interview, no background check, nothing? This was exactly the kind of poor management he had expected to find. Employees weren't carefully vetted or trained. They were thrown into work simply because the motel was desperate to keep running. "Sure," Ethan said. "Good. Tessa, show him around," Damien ordered before disappearing into the back. Tessa handed Ethan a spare name tag and gestured for him to follow her behind the desk. "That was easy," he remarked. She let out a humorless chuckle. "Yeah, it always is. People don't last long here." That told him a lot. If turnover was that bad, the motel's problems went even deeper than he thought. As Tessa began walking him through the check-in system, Ethan kept his eyes open. He wasn't just here to do a job. He was here to uncover just how broken this place really was. Ethan spent his first few hours shadowing Tessa at the front desk, observing every interaction, every detail. It didn't take long for the cracks in the motel's operations to become painfully obvious. Liam, the front desk clerk from the night before, barely acknowledged guests, mumbling half-hearted greetings while scrolling through his phone. When guests asked questions, he either shrugged dismissively or redirected them to someone else. More than once, Ethan noticed Tessa subtly stepping in to correct his mistakes, fixing botched reservations, and smoothing over customer frustrations. The phone rang at least a dozen times before anyone picked it up, usually Tessa since Liam let it ring out. When she was busy, it simply went unanswered. Ethan watched as a woman at the counter, clearly exhausted from a long drive, waited nearly 5 minutes before anyone even looked up to help her. In between check-ins, Ethan glanced around the lobby. The furniture looked worn out, the carpet was stained, and the vending machine in the corner was completely empty. This wasn't just a matter of bad service. The motel itself felt neglected. The deeper problems became even clearer when Ethan spoke to the housekeeping staff. Passing through the back hallway, he noticed a woman in her 40s, Rosa, leaning against a supply cart, rubbing her temples. Her uniform was slightly wrinkled, her expression tired. "Long shift?" Ethan asked casually. She let out a dry chuckle. "Always." "Short-staffed?" Rosa nodded. "They cut 2 housekeeping positions last month. We're still expected to clean the same number of rooms. We barely keep up." Ethan frowned. A motel this size couldn't afford to have fewer housekeepers. It would only lead to rushed poor cleaning and frustrated guests, and from what he had already seen, it was clear that no one in management cared enough to fix it. He made his way toward the maintenance room next, where a grizzled older man named Frank was hunched over a workbench repairing a broken chair leg. Ethan knocked on the doorframe, and Frank looked up, raising an eyebrow. "You knew?" "Yeah," Ethan said, "just trying to get familiar with everything." Frank snorted. "You're in the wrong place then. Front desk workers don't usually come back here." "Figured I should know who keeps the place running," Ethan said, nodding toward the toolbox. "Saw a guest complaining about a broken heater earlier. Front desk said maintenance wasn't available." Frank scoffed. "That's because they didn't bother to tell me. Half the time they'd rather let guests complain than actually deal with a problem." That was all Ethan needed to hear. The staff wasn't just ignoring guests, they were ignoring each other. There was no communication, no teamwork, just a handful of exhausted employees trying to get through the day with as little effort as possible. And the worst part? The general manager, Mark, was nowhere to be found. It didn't take long for Ethan to witness firsthand how poor management was affecting guests. Midway through his shift, a middle-aged man in a wrinkled suit stormed up to the front desk, his face flushed with frustration. "I need another room," the man said, slapping his keycard down on the counter. "The heater in mine isn't working." Liam, predictably, barely looked up from his phone. "Yeah, sorry, we're fully booked." The guest's jaw tightened. "Then get maintenance to fix it." Liam sighed as if this conversation was beneath him. "Maintenance isn't available right now." Ethan, standing a few feet away, had already spoken to Frank, the maintenance worker, and knew that wasn't true. Frank had been in the back, fixing a chair when Ethan last checked. The guest wasn't asking for much, just for his room to be habitable. But Liam couldn't be bothered to take the extra step to solve the problem. Before Ethan could intervene, the door to Mark's office swung open. The general manager stepped out, adjusting his tie with a well-practiced fake smile. "Is there a problem here?" "Yes," the guest snapped. "Your employee is refusing to help me. I have a broken heater, and I need a new room." Mark didn't even glance at Liam. He didn't need to. Instead, he turned back to the guest and offered him a polished corporate response, completely devoid of sincerity. "I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience, sir, but unfortunately we are at full capacity. There's nothing we can do at the moment." Ethan clenched his jaw. Mark wasn't trying to fix the problem. He was trying to make it go away. The guest scoffed. "This is ridiculous. I'll be calling corporate." Mark's fake smile didn't waver. "You're free to do that, sir." Without another word, the guest stormed out, muttering under his breath. As soon as he was gone, Mark turned to Liam. "Next time, just tell them we're working on it, don't argue." Ethan couldn't believe what he was seeing. Not only was Mark refusing to take responsibility, but he was also teaching his employees to lie rather than solve problems. No wonder the motel was failing. Tessa, who had watched the exchange in silence, let out a quiet breath, looking uncomfortable. "That happen a lot?" Ethan asked her quietly. She nodded, lowering her voice. "Yeah, all the time." Ethan had seen enough. Mark wasn't just a bad manager, he was the root of the problem. And soon, he was going to find out just how badly he had underestimated his new employee. Ethan had seen enough. Over the course of just one day, he had witnessed guests being ignored, staff cutting corners, maintenance requests dismissed, and a general manager who treated real problems like minor inconveniences to be brushed aside. But the moment that finally pushed him over the edge came later that evening, when yet another guest was turned away simply for being local. A woman in her early 30s approached the desk, her expression tense but polite. "I need a room for the night," she said, placing her credit card on the counter. Liam barely looked at her before shaking his head. "Sorry, we don't rent to locals." The woman's face fell. "But why? I just need a place to stay for the night. I'll pay up front." Liam sighed, looking annoyed that he even had to explain. "It's policy. Management says locals bring trouble." Before Ethan could say anything, Mark emerged from his office, arms crossed, already ready to back up the nonsense. "We've had problems before," he said smoothly. "People using the rooms for things that aren't exactly legal. So we don't take the risk." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. So they were assuming every local was a criminal? He had built his motel chain on the idea of offering affordable lodging to anyone who needed it. Yet here was Mark, turning away paying customers based on nothing but assumptions. The woman shook her head in disbelief. This is ridiculous. I just need a safe place to sleep. Mark gave her a forced, insincere smile. I'm afraid I can't help you. Ethan couldn't take it anymore. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm, but his decision was made. Mark had to go. Before walking away, Ethan caught a glimpse of Tessa, who had been watching the entire exchange, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Ethan could tell she hated this just as much as he did. He turned and walked toward the break room, needing a moment to process. But he wasn't backing down. Tonight, he will prepare. Tomorrow, he will stop pretending. Mark and the rest of the staff had no idea, but their new hire was about to become their worst nightmare. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the motel with a clear goal in mind. Mark was done. No more excuses, no more hiding behind fake smiles and empty apologies. He had spent the last 24 hours watching the place fall apart under Mark's so-called leadership, and now it was time to put an end to it. He waited for the right moment. Mark was in his office, scrolling through his computer, probably looking at revenue numbers instead of actually managing the motel. Ethan didn't bother knocking. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. Mark glanced up, frowning. What do you want? Ethan didn't waste time. I want to talk about how you're running this place. Mark scoffed, leaning back in his chair. Oh? And what makes you think you have a say in that? Ethan took a step closer. Because I own it. For a moment, silence hung in the air. Mark blinked, his expression twisting in confusion, before realization dawned. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Ethan let the moment sink in before continuing. For the last day, I've been working here. I've seen the way you treat guests. I've seen how you ignore complaints, how you let the front desk dismiss people, how you push off problems rather than fix them. I watched you refuse service to a paying customer last night based on nothing but assumptions. His voice was calm but firm. And I've seen enough. Mark shook his head quickly, trying to recover. Mr. Caldwell, I didn't know. That's exactly the problem, Ethan cut in. You don't know what's going on in your own motel, and worse, you don't care. You've built a culture where employees do the bare minimum, where guests are treated like an inconvenience, and where no one is held accountable. He folded his arms. That changes today. You're fired. Mark's face went pale. Wait, Mr. Caldwell, please, let's talk about this. There's nothing to talk about. Ethan stepped aside and gestured to the door. Pack your things and leave by the end of the day. The rest of the motel had gone quiet. Employees were peeking around corners, watching from behind desks, their eyes wide. Ethan knew they had all overheard the conversation. He let them hear every word on purpose. As Ethan stepped out of the office, Tessa stood near the front desk, her expression unreadable. Mark hesitated, looking like he wanted to argue, but Ethan had already moved on. He turned to the gathered staff, his voice carrying through the lobby. Jason is no longer with this motel. Changes are coming. For the first time since arriving, Ethan saw a shift in the employees' expressions. Not fear, but something close to relief. It was time to rebuild, and he wasn't leaving until it was done right. With Mark gone, the motel felt different, lighter, less suffocating. But Ethan knew that firing a bad manager wasn't enough. The staff had spent too long under poor leadership, and if things were going to change, they needed to hear it straight from him. He stepped forward, glancing around at the employees who had gathered near the front desk. Some looked nervous, some skeptical, and a few, like Tessa, seemed cautiously hopeful. Things are going to be different from now on, Ethan said, his voice steady. I've spent the last 24 hours seeing firsthand how this place has been run, and I'll be honest with you, it's unacceptable. His gaze swept across the room. But I'm not here to punish people who have been stuck in a bad system. I'm here to fix it. A murmur spread through the staff. They had heard promises before, but this time felt different. First, Ethan continued, that ridiculous policy against locals, gone. This is a motel, not a private club. If someone has the money to pay, they get a room. End of story. He saw a few nods, especially from Tessa and some of the housekeeping staff. Second, maintenance requests will be taken seriously. If something breaks, it gets fixed. No more ignoring guests just because it's easier. He glanced at Frank, the maintenance worker, who crossed his arms and nodded approvingly. Third, I know a lot of you have been overworked, underappreciated, and left to fend for yourselves. That stops now. He turned his attention to Tessa. You've been the only person holding this place together, and I see that. Starting today, you're the new assistant manager. Tessa's eyes widened. Wait, what? What? Ethan nodded. You're the only person I've seen actually trying to do the right thing. That's the kind of leadership this place needs. A few employees exchanged surprised glances. Some seemed relieved that the promotion was going to someone who deserved it. For the rest of you, Ethan continued, if you want to do better, you'll have my full support. But if you think you can keep coasting like before, you won't last. The room fell into a tense silence until Carl, the maintenance worker, let out a low chuckle. About damn time someone cleaned this place up. A ripple of agreement spread through the group. Ethan exhaled, knowing this was only the beginning, but for the first time, change was in motion. Ethan knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. The staff needed to see real changes, and they needed to see them fast. After his announcement, he wasted no time putting his plans into action. The first major change was lifting the ridiculous no local policy. He personally updated the system to remove the restriction, then gathered the front desk staff. From now on, if someone has money to pay, they get a room. No more turning people away because of baseless assumption. Tessa looked relieved, while Liam, who had enforced the rule without question, looked less enthusiastic. Ethan made a mental note to keep an eye on him. Next, he addressed the motel's terrible maintenance system. He met with Frank, the maintenance worker, and asked him to list all the outstanding repair requests. Within minutes, Ethan realized just how much had been ignored. Broken air conditioners, leaky faucets, flickering hallway lights, all things guests had complained about but were never properly handled. From now on, Ethan told Frank, maintenance gets reported directly to you, no middlemen. I want you fixing things the moment they come in. Frank nodded, seeming pleased that his work was finally being taken seriously. Housekeeping was next. Ethan spoke with Rosa and the other housekeepers, asking what they needed most. The answer was obvious: more staff. We're drowning, Rosa admitted. We don't have enough people to keep up. Ethan made an immediate decision. He would bring in additional hires to take the pressure off the cleaning crew. That meant fewer rushed jobs, cleaner rooms, and better reviews from guests. Finally, Ethan pulled Tessa aside. Now that she was officially assistant manager, he wanted her to help lead the front desk. I need you to set a new tone here, he told her. Train the staff properly. Make sure guests feel welcome, not ignored. Tessa nodded, looking more determined than ever. I'll do my best. By the end of the day, the atmosphere in the motel had already begun to shift. Staff, who had once dragged their feet, now seemed cautiously optimistic. Employees whispered among themselves, wondering if the changes were real. And for the first time in a long while, guests at the front desk were being treated with actual professionalism. Ethan knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time since arriving, he felt like the motel was finally moving in the right direction. Fixing operations was one thing, but Ethan knew that real change wouldn't last unless the employees actually wanted to be there. The deeper problem wasn't just bad leadership. It was a workplace where no one felt valued. High turnover, exhaustion, and lack of motivation weren't just side effects of poor management. They were direct results of employees feeling like their work didn't matter. If he wanted the motel to truly improve, he needed to fix that too. That evening, Ethan sat down with Tessa and Damien, the assistant manager, to discuss the biggest issue no one had talked about yet: pay. The truth is, Ethan said, we're losing people because they don't feel like this job is worth it. If we want good employees to stay, we need to make it worth their time. Damien folded his arms, skeptical. That's going to cost a lot. It'll cost more to keep replacing people every few months, Ethan countered. Higher turnover means more time wasted on hiring and training, and worse customer service because no one sticks around long enough to care. Tessa, who had been quiet, finally spoke. If people felt like they mattered here, they'd stay. That was all Ethan needed to hear. By the next morning, he made it official. Wages for all employees would increase. It wasn't a massive jump, but it was enough to show them that things were changing. When Ethan gathered the staff later that day and made the announcement, the reaction was immediate. Employees exchanged surprised glances, some looking stunned, others visibly relieved. Rosa, the housekeeper who had been exhausted just the day before, let out a soft, disbelieving laugh. "Didn't think I'd ever see that happen." Frank, the maintenance worker, clapped Ethan on the shoulder as he passed. "About damn time someone understood that we're not machines." For the first time since he arrived, Ethan saw something new in the employees' faces: hope. They weren't just waiting for things to go back to how they were before. They were starting to believe that this time, change was real. The motel's problems weren't solved overnight, but this was the final, necessary step to turning things around, and Ethan wasn't going anywhere until he saw it through. A week later, the motel was already unrecognizable from the mess it had been when Ethan first arrived. The front desk staff was finally doing their jobs right. Tessa had stepped up as assistant manager, ensuring that check-ins ran smoothly and guests weren't ignored. Even Liam, who had once barely looked up from his phone, was making an effort, either because he actually cared now or because he knew Ethan wouldn't tolerate laziness. Either way, it was progress. In housekeeping, Rosa and her team were no longer drowning in work. With the addition of 2 new hires, the cleaning schedule was finally manageable. Guests noticed the difference. Rooms were actually clean when they checked in, and complaints about hygiene had already dropped. For the first time in months, positive reviews started coming in. Maintenance had also improved. Frank, now given proper authority, ensured that every request was actually handled. No more broken heaters left untouched, no more leaky faucets ignored. He even started tackling long-neglected repairs, fixing hallway lights and deep-cleaning ventilation systems. The motel wasn't just functional again, it actually felt like a place people wanted to stay. Perhaps the biggest change, though, was the staff's overall morale. Before, they had been exhausted, unmotivated, just trying to get through the day. Now, things were different. With fair wages, better leadership, and a clear sense of direction, employees actually cared. They worked with purpose instead of indifference. Even Damien, the assistant manager who had initially been skeptical of Ethan's reforms, admitted that things felt different, better. Ethan didn't just issue commands from behind an office door. He stayed involved, helping where he could, making sure that changes weren't temporary. He checked in with employees, listened to their concerns, and let them see firsthand that he wasn't like Mark. By the end of the week, as Ethan walked through the lobby, he saw something that hadn't been there before: pride. Employees stood a little taller, guests actually looked happy, and for the first time the motel felt alive. The job wasn't done. There would always be things to improve, new challenges to face. But the motel was no longer a place full of people who had given up. It was a place with a future. And Ethan wasn't about to let it slip back into the mess it had been before. This time, the change was real. The story of Ethan Caldwell's undercover experience at his own motel highlights a powerful lesson about leadership, accountability, and the importance of valuing employees. Businesses don't fail because of bad luck, they fail because of bad management. Ethan's motel was falling apart not because of the staff, but because poor leadership had created a culture of indifference and neglect. Employees weren't motivated because they weren't treated with respect. Guests were unhappy because no one cared about their experience. Problems weren't fixed because management ignored them rather than taking responsibility. Ethan's approach teaches that real change comes from the top down. Firing one bad manager wasn't enough. He had to rebuild trust, morale, and a sense of purpose. By actively listening to his employees, addressing their concerns, and making fair changes, such as lifting discriminatory policies and improving wages, he transformed the motel into a place where both staff and guests felt valued. The key takeaway is simple. Leadership isn't about authority, it's about responsibility. When businesses invest in their employees, treat them with respect, and prioritize customer experience, success follows naturally. If you want a strong team, you don't just demand better, you create an environment where people want to do better.